work in the marketing operations department, and we basically help get campaigns out for telesales and account managers throughout the business and help generate revenue.
Okay. So we're going to look at some quotations, so or glossaries. So what's the difference between a solicitor and barrister?
Okay, so a solicitor basically predominantly kind of deals with non-contentious work, so that's things that kind of aren't going to court, essentially. They'll have a number of clients who they kind of advise day to day on various issues, and then if, say, a problem does arise, then they might prepare some information for court and for a barrister who's going to argue on their behalf in court. But the rules have changed a bit now, and some solicitors can apply to actually argue in courts themselves, in the lower down courts. They can't go to the higher up ones yet. So there is a bit of a blurred line nowadays between a solicitor and a barrister. And so essentially what the barrister does is they receive the briefs from the solicitor, and then they go into court on the firm's behalf and try and either defend or prosecute.
Excellent. So what is a lawyer and counsel and advocate that people come across?
So I think these are all basically just kind of generic terms that can apply to kind of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So a lawyer can either be a solicitor or a barrister. Counsel, same thing again, but sometimes when we say counsel we can mean like a general counsel or in-house counsel, which would be a lawyer within a company who kind of advises the company on day-to-day matters and employment issues and things like that in company law. And then an advocate is predominantly kind of more for kind of in reference to a barrister, but again it could be a lawyer, solicitor as well, so you and I are mixing up the terms.
Okay. What's the bar and what are chambers?
Okay, so the bar is basically where all barristers work. Essentially the bar is just a reference for barristers and the industry that they're in, like saying we're a publishing company. And then chambers is all barristers will be a member of a chambers. Basically it's just a big group of barristers who kind of come together under the name, say like 11 Kingsbench Walk or Red Line Court, so you can kind of use your group profile, and you usually specialise in certain areas, say like personal injury, employment or human rights, and so you can have your own personal profile, but you can also use the chambers profile to get work. So that's kind of how that works.
And are barristers generally self-employed?
Yeah, they're self-employed generally speaking.
And what about solicitors?
They usually work for a law firm or work for themselves, so
Okay.
they might head up their own firm.
Okay. What is a litigator?
So a litigator, again, is kind of another reference for a barrister, as someone who kind of goes to court and deals with contentious work, so where there's issues, either criminal issues where the Crown Prosecution Service is prosecuting a defendant, or in a civil case where, say, I'm suing you for various reasons, like I don't like this video.
What about what's the judiciary?
So the judiciary is just kind of another term or reference for the kind of the judges and the juries that kind of decide the outcomes of cases.
Okay. What's the difference between a judge, a magistrate and a justice of the peace?
So they're all kind of predominantly the same thing, they just work in different bits of the court system. So judges is just a general term for all people deciding on cases anyway. It might be within a court, or it could be, say, an appeals tribunal, an employment tribunal, kind of anybody who's making that kind of decision of the final outcome. And then you've got specific judges, so there's specific judges in the magistrates' courts, which are called magistrates, and same for justice of the peace as well.
Okay. What's the clerk to the court?
So the clerk to the court, I might get this a little bit wrong, they're basically there to kind of aid the procedure of the court and make sure everything's kind of running smoothly. They'll kind of probably type up the judge's judgment and things like that, and kind of help them out with the kind of filing side of things.
Okay.
Stuff.
Is there a difference between a specialist and a generalist practitioner?
Yeah, so a generalist practitioner would kind of, as the name says, kind of deal with lots of different types of things. So that might be, say, your high street practitioner who deals with lots of generalist areas around kind of private law, so things that I might need to do, like kind of wills and probate, maybe some employment law issues potentially, family law, divorce and all that kind of stuff, whereas a specialist will just focus on one specific thing and probably be very well regarded within that field. So for example, they might only deal with biotechnological patents, for example.
Okay, what's the difference between a corporate and a company lawyer?
Corporate and company lawyer, in my head there's not really much difference between the two of them. They're dealing with the same kinds of things. So a company lawyer would be interested in all the laws that affect a company, and then a corporate lawyer would be all those kinds of things and maybe a few extra ones as well, but I don't know that kind of in-depth.
Do companies employ their own lawyers full-time on salaries?
Yep, so companies will have them. You'll generally call them in-house counsel or general counsel rather than company lawyers necessarily.
Cool.
And they'll do more than just company law. They might kind of give advice on employment issues within the business or data protection, for example. Ian McDougall in our business kind of tells us what we can have on our order forms and all that kind of stuff, advice on lots of different things around the business.
Okay. What's the difference between a legal secretary and a company secretary?
So a legal secretary will work for a lawyer or a barrister or a solicitor, that kind of thing, and would just kind of have general kind of admin duties. Whereas a company secretary, you have to be qualified for that. They'll quite often be a solicitor before they become a company secretary, and they kind of fill in the various duties that the company needs them to do. For example, making sure the firm is registered at Companies House and making sure all the board of directors know when the meetings are and what has to be discussed in those kinds of meetings, and dealing with various kind of company law issues that fall specifically under the company secretary's role.
And what's a company director?
Company director is someone who helps run the business, usually sits on the board and things like that.
Okay, broadly, what's the difference between an LLP and a partnership?
So an LLP is a limited liability partnership, which quite a lot of law firms use and take advantage of because it limits their liability if things go wrong within the company, whereas a partnership doesn't have that kind of limitation. They can open up a whole can of worms, basically.
Okay. All right. So, what is the difference between? What is an act?
So, an act is basically a piece of law that's been passed by the governing body that says you either can do something or you can't do something. They're usually pretty, well, I say straightforward, but the language that they're written is often quite difficult.
And so, what's legislation?
So, legislation is an act, but it can also, or a statute, but it also includes things like statutory instruments and other kind of compliance and regulatory things that are put together either by the government, so your House of Commons and your House of Lords passing things and getting signed off by the Queen, or by other regulatory bodies that are set up by the government, various quangos and things like that, which can also kind of put in place various rules and procedures that people have to follow.
Okay. What's a statutory instrument and what's a statute?
So a statute, again, is just kind of another way of saying an act or law or legislation. And then one of the ways that we've described statutory instruments before is they're basically either the rule book that helps you, gives you more information about the statute, or it's the meat on the bones. So we've said before, say your manager tells you you have to be in at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's your kind of statute, your law. And then the statutory instrument might kind of determine how you've got to get there for 9 o'clock. Do you have to get the train, or can you get any kind of transport? What are the requirements?
Okay, and what's a precedent?
So a precedent is basically, it could be a judgment which kind of sets a certain point of law, which then all other kind of judges have to follow if there's a similar case coming into court. But then there's also another use of the term precedent, which we use on some of our online products, which is basically a form like that you kind of fill in. So it's a typical kind of forms that you use in your day-to-day legal practice.
Okay, what's the difference between the law of tort and civil law?
So the law of tort is basically there's been a bad situation, I've sat down on this chair and it's broken and I'm going to sue the company for injuries and things like that. Civil law, so that's a very specific area of civil law, and civil law covers a lot more things than just me suing somebody because I've, say, hurt myself, or it includes things like libel and defamation and all kinds of other bits of law as well.
Okay, and the difference between civil law and criminal law, broadly?
So, okay, so criminal law, that's relatively straightforward. There's various statutes in place that say things like you can't murder somebody, or you can't kind of intend to hurt somebody and things like that. And what happens then is the Crown Prosecution Service and the Queen kind of brings a case against you, the defendant, and that's kind of criminal law. And then civil law is basically everything else that's kind of not dealt with that. It's things which aren't the country and the Crown being against you, it's company to company, person to person.
Okay. What is intellectual property?
So intellectual property, it can be many things. So basically you've got, it might be, say, a patent, so it might be the design of something, for example, Dyson, or it could be your intellectual property, so like your creative copyright, so you might have a song or something like that that you want to try and protect, and so intellectual property just gives you the ways of protecting things which are kind of more intangible, so maybe like Coca-Cola's secret recipe as to why Coca-Cola tastes the way it does as opposed to Pepsi, things like that. And they've got a huge amount of worth, so like things like your intellectual property can be written down in your company accounts as to, I think Coca-Cola's is like millions and billions of pounds just for their kind of recipe, so it's very high profile stuff.
Okay. What's the difference between trademark and copyright?
Oh god.
Not sure?
I'm not sure about that one so much.
What is the difference between UK law, English law and Scottish law in general? Are there different laws or are they all the same?
Okay, so they're
and European law for
okay. So they're all laws, they just have varying degrees of jurisdiction basically. So the EU can pass certain laws and directives which, based on people being members of the EU, they then have to implement within their own countries. So you're probably, so we had like the human rights kind of law was first kind of passed in the EU, and that led the UK to passing the Human Rights Act of 2006 or 8 or something like that. So they kind of have to codify whatever the EU puts into place. So the UK then has its own set of laws, which usually should be aligned with EU, and then within that, because we now have devolved parliaments and things like that, Scotland can have its own laws as well. So some of the things that apply to England might not necessarily apply to Scotland and vice versa. So not, well, I guess kind of related to legislation and jurisdiction, things like that. You've got Scottish university fees. So people who live in Scotland don't have to pay fees to go to university, but if, say, I wanted to go to Edinburgh University, I would have to pay fees.
Excellent. Okay, good. We're well over halfway now. So what, and again, briefly if you want, what's a contract?
So a contract is just a written agreement between two people satisfying various things along the way that it's valid, that says that I'm going to do X for Y, usually.
Okay. What's liability?
So liability is basically I can't think of how to phrase it. It's, you're liable for something. I've done something and I've got to kind of suffer the consequences almost, I guess. Or not the bad consequences, maybe good consequences.
Okay. Sometimes I'll come across the words joint and several. Joint and several liability? Or?
Okay, so if you're a company, your board of directors might all be kind of jointly liable, or you might be like, if you're the only head, you might be the only person who's liable and things like that. So it's just whether or not there's a group kind of liability or just a personal one.
Okay. What does insolvency mean?
So insolvency is basically kind of you declare yourself insolvent or bankrupt. You haven't got the funds to pay off various debts and things like that.
Okay. What is misrepresentation?
So misrepresentation is when you've kind of said something and it's not entirely true. So like if we were doing an advert and we said that Butterworth's Employment Law Handbook will ensure that you never get sued, that's probably most likely going to be misrepresentation. We can't guarantee that kind of stuff, and the Advertising Standards Board would come down quite heavily on us.
Okay. What's the difference between negligence and nuisance in legal terms?
So negligence is basically when you haven't done something that you should be doing. You kind of omitted to do some kind of action or something like that. So for example, maybe the facilities team have been cleaning the floor outside, it's wet, they haven't put one of those nice little stands warning us that it's wet, and they'll probably be seen as being negligent if somebody hurts themselves. The active nuisance is quite different. That's more somebody doing a certain behaviour which is going to cause harm rather than just forgetting to do something.
Excellent. The difference between libel and defamation.
One's written and one's not.
Is it?
I always forget which one's which.
Okay.
So one's like kind of, they're quite similar. There's like libel, slander and defamation. I think libel is
well
written,
while you're in it.
yeah. I think libel is written like in the paper and stuff like that. Defamation is defamation on your character, so that might be me saying something to somebody else, kind of hearsay almost. And then slander is basically kind of, I think, a term kind of that covers both of them really. So I think libel and defamation are the legal terms,
Okay.
but you might want to check this.
Fantastic. No, that's good. What's the difference between restitution and damages?
So restitution is paying you back for something that should have been yours kind of anyway, and then damages is extra on top of that. So I might get emotional damages or something like that, or yeah, that's basically it.
So when someone is awarded costs, what does that mean?
So if they're awarded costs, they don't have to pay for taking the action to court, for example. So if it's a civil suit and somebody was trying to sue me for something, but I won as the defendant, as it were, then I might get awarded the costs. So I don't have to pay my barrister, the other person has to pay for us having to go to court.
Okay, what's the difference between proceedings and a hearing?
I don't know, actually.
Or is
there
there?
a difference?
Maybe not. 2 words for the same thing?
Could be just 2 words for something.
Okay. What's the difference between litigation and claim?
So litigation is when you're actively going to court to argue something, like a point of law. A claim is when, so you kind of use claim in a slightly different way. You might have an insurance claim that you then want to litigate about. So that's kind of maybe how you differentiate between them.
Excellent. Difference between dispute and conflict?
I'd say that's pretty much the same.
Okay,
thing, yeah.
good. What is a pleading?
So your pleading is, that's basically predominantly, I would say, used in criminal cases, and it's just you basically saying how you're going to plead your case. You're saying what your liability is. You're either saying you're not guilty because you don't think you've done anything wrong, or maybe you've fully confess and you are guilty, or there's other kind of various things like I can't think of them, manslaughter and things like that. So you kind of weren't really aware of what you're doing, or it was an accident, and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. What is annotation?
So an annotation is, it's basically just a kind of short note. So in our books we quite often say that our Butterworth's Law Handbook series have annotations in them, and it's just a short note kind of giving you a bit more information about that particular piece of legislation. Quite often it's usually like when it's come into force, or it might refer you to a case that's kind of important you can go find somewhere else, or it might refer you, it might just kind of briefly explain a word or something like that. So it's not full-on commentary, it's just a quick brief note in case there's a moment of uncertainty.
What do they mean when they say case management?
Case management, so that's basically just kind of how you're managing your cases, I would say.
Okay. When they talk about drafting, what do they mean?
So drafting, you're just kind of writing, so we quite often say that the government is drafting legislation. So what they're doing is they've got a group of kind of specialists who know about the industry, who are writing up potential new legislation, which is then quite often debated, as we've seen with like the health bill, for example, recently, to get it to a point where kind of as many people as possible are happy with it. Sometimes they don't care about that and they just pass it anyway.
Okay. What's the difference between contentious and non-contentious?
So that's kind of contentious stuff is litigated stuff, and non-contentious things is kind of non-litigated stuff. So it's just, yeah, kind of, it's got a more
Okay.
argumentative and not so argumentative.
Well, what's the difference between amendment and repeal?
So an amendment basically is just, there's a piece of legislation and it's now 2 years later and we just want to make a slight change to point B in that legislation. What repeal does, it basically says, okay, this piece of legislation, that point B, we're not just going to change it, we just want to get rid of it completely, it's no longer relevant. So they repeal it, probably either just in its entirety or they repeal it with a new piece of law.
Okay. What do they mean when they say an act is in force?
So that means that it's currently live, we have to comply with it basically.
Okay. What's the difference between transaction and disclosure?
So a transaction is you doing something, so like me giving you something, and disclosure is me telling you something.
Excellent. Briefly, what is money laundering?
So money laundering is basically, I've got some money through illicit means, on the black market maybe, and I'm trying to make it clean money by doing various things to it so that I can then kind of use it and actually benefit from all my black market activity.
Okay. There's lots of different types of court. There's magistrate court, county court, high court, supreme court, European court, tribunals and judicial reviews. What does it mean?
So basically if you're kind of bringing a case in front of a judge and things like that, there's various bits of the courts you go through first. So you probably usually be going through tribunals first. For example, in employment law, you'd be going through employment tribunal. If you're not happy, then you might be going to the appeals tribunal. If you're still not happy, then you start going through the regular UK court system. So as you said, you've got magistrates courts and county courts, then the kind of crown courts if you're in criminal. Then you've got the Court of Appeal, House of Lords, and now the Supreme Court, which has come in over the last 2 years or so. If you're still not happy with it, then it could potentially go to the European Court for a kind of final decision, and they'll pass it back for them to just go, okay, fine, that's good. If you're not happy with if you're not happy with something within the legislation, how it all works, then you go to the judicial review. So it's something quite separate to all the other things. It's not part of the normal court system. It's to change the whole thing in its entirety, really. Somebody's dealt with something badly. Okay,
so is there a difference between magistrates court and county court?
Yes.
What is the difference?
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Is it that in magistrate you have three magistrates who are not judges, they are justices of the peace, they're not actual judges, they're people who are deemed to be professional, and a county court would be with a judge?
So that sounds right, but so magistrates could be a lay person like you or me. We get trained up very briefly and then take that on as a job. Then you can get promoted from that to being the other kind of judge as well. I think there's various limitations in terms of sentencing that you can do, maybe awards, and kind of if it's a really big kind of claim, it might have to jump a couple of stages. So there are kind of various rules like that that come into place that kind of determine what court you go to and whether or not it's the lowest one or the next one up, just in the initial stages. But I don't know all the exact details.
Okay, good. Last section. That's very good. What is an estate?
So the estate is basically everything I own or have claim to. So if I was lucky enough to have a house, it would include my house. But then also, say, my bank accounts, if I had a car, my car, if I had a stake in any kind of business or overseas property or anything like that, trust funds, all those kinds of things.
And what is a trust?
So a trust is something else entirely. That might be, it doesn't necessarily have to be money, you could have land in trust and things like that, but it's basically some sort of asset that's put under trusteeship. So you've got a few people who decide how that runs, and then you might get money or coming off that every year being given straight to me, or it might be when I become a certain age I might get it, or it's just usually kind of kept in trust for somebody else basically.
What's the difference then between a trustee and a beneficiary?
So the trustees are the people who are running the trust, and the beneficiary is the person who's getting, say, either the stuff off the top on a yearly basis, or who actually officially kind of owns it but doesn't really run it. So say if I've got really, really rich parents, they might set up a trust that, say, my granddad and my uncle run, and I will be the beneficiary of that trust.
Okay, what's the difference between will and probate?
I'm not entirely sure exactly. Not so good at that.
Isn't the will the form of this is what I wish to happen, and probate is the process of saying that that's...
Of how it actually happens.
Yes, I think that's
That
right,
sounds
isn't it?
about
Yeah, okay, good. And what is an executor?
So executor is basically just somebody who does all the things that the will states, so that kind of who just makes sure that all those processes happen.
Okay. And if someone has power of attorney, what does that mean?
Oh, that basically means that some poor person is not deemed to necessarily be in their right mind anymore, and they've nominated somebody else. So quite often you might find this happening with your grandparents when they get old or get dementia. They'll nominate your parents to be there, to have power of attorney over them, so they can make their decisions and run various things for them and kind of deal with their bank accounts.
Is that quite different from an executor?
Yes, so that's kind of whilst that person's still alive, whereas the executor then comes into force when they're dead.
And lastly, what's stamp duty?
So stamp duty is that horrible thing that you have to pay whenever if you're going to buy somewhere that's over £250,000, you have to pay a certain percentage, and it goes up according to the band that your house is in, and that money goes straight to the treasury. Evil.
Excellent. Did you say evil?
Yeah.